All right, so my thoughts were kind of some of the top three things that I've seen parents expect for their kids as they go into to be young adults. Is they one big thing is I think they just want their kids to be able to find a church. I think any parent of any spiritual depth generally tends to want their kid to find some church in college so that they stay, somewhat spiritually on track, and that seems to be kind of the goalpost in a lot of parents' view of how their kid's doing spiritually if they whether or not they go to a church at all. Um, I think parents want their kids to be able to leave a good legacy, whether that's necessarily have Christian or spiritual roots or not. I think most parents want their kids to be able to eventually have a good wife and obedient kids and that kind of thing. Um, so those were kind of my main thoughts for what parents in general want. And for me specifically, kind of the three things that I really hope to see in my kids one day when they become young adults is that primarily that they're radically in love with Christ, and so that their love for Christ and that their desire to glorify Christ would essentially guide everything that they do in regards to uh, where they go to church, what they do in their schooling, who they marry. So I hope that that love for Christ overflows in all areas of their lives. And then secondly, I hope that my kids one day will be big influencers and serve within the church. And as a result of serving in the church and not just being served, that they'll be able to reach out missionally and evangelically and serving the people around them. And then thirdly, I do really hope that my kids will also leave a Christian legacy. And I just like I hope to help lead my kids to the Lord. I hope that my future kids will continue a legacy of family members, of men and women that desire to put Christ first and to love Christ radically. So those are my three things.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Uh, for me, the average parents in the church, I think they have most three highest priority in this way. The first one I was thinking about, they want their children learning how to be a good child. And I'm not sure what that good means for them, but they for sure kind of giving an opportunity, let them know, let them be taught some way, and even some other life skills like the communication and leadership skill. Most parents really want their children to learn those skills and want them to be a good child in a house, in the world, anywhere. And the second one I was thinking about is the parents want them to have good friends. And it might be a spiritually good friend, but I have seen many times not just spiritually good friend, but parents want them to have friends who encourage them to study or inspire them to do things more deeper and diverse way, more like secular way. Parents want them to have a good friend. And last one, third one is parents want their children to have some kind of spiritual idea and spiritual knowledge. It could be the spiritual, the word spiritual maybe meaning is in the Bible, but most of the time they don't really think in theologically, biblically well, but they just think about the spiritually as a praying to somehow, somewhere, something to do, so, like to whom can do better things for them. They have those kind of ideas for their children. And for me, if I have a children, the three priority things for them. First thing I want to mention is I want them to love their God with all heart and soul and might, and not just loving God as emotionally and not just like doing something, but with their deep heart and deep mind, care about Him and know about Him and consider about Him with all their lives. I hope my children will reflect to love God, like loving more and more Him. And second one is by reflecting those love toward God, I want them to love their neighbors. It can be their friend, it can be their coworker if they work somewhere, it can be their church members, it can be any people around them. It's not the way they love to human as a emotionally somehow like man to man, but it's the way that God loves those neighbors. I want them to love how God loves them, and I want them to reflect that love. And the other one is kind of result of these two priorities is the I want them to be a true follower of Christ and worshiper of God and disciple empowered by the Spirit. Uh, I don't want them to just like talk about the loving God and loving neighbor, but I want them to practically living as a follower and disciple of God and Christ and the Spirit in their life.
All right. So from my experience, the average adult or the average parents in the church, their expectations for their kids are a good education, a good job, and either a good spouse or a good income. And while all of those sound like good priorities, really they translate into a lack of trust in God to provide for their children. They kind of see it as a safety net. I have a senior in the youth group that I was talking to recently that just wanted more information about the seminary because he's looking at going into pastoral ministry. And when I was talking to his dad later about it, he said, no, I want him to go to some other school so he can get a degree in business just in case he ends up at some rural church where he has to be bivocational. He can have this secondary income. And it kind of struck me as a little odd with this father being one of the lay leaders within our church, and I think it's very telling of the church as a whole. For my children, as they're growing, my wife and I have discussed this recently. Our two biggest goals in discipling them are to instill a high regard for Christ, because anything else that comes after that, if it doesn't stem from a love for Christ, and a right view of who he is, then anything else after that ultimately is a failure. And then secondly, a heart for the nations, being in preparation to go into the field to serve as missionaries. Our heart is that their hearts would catch on to that, and that they would see people the way Christ saw them, and that they would love people the way Christ loved them, and not just people of their same ethnicity or background, but all people. And then lastly, we want to disciple them in the way that they would look for and find a godly spouse, a spouse that would reflect the first two priorities of discipleship the same as they do, and would spur them on to be stronger disciples of Christ. And I think those three probably sum up our discipleship priorities for our children.